I've struck men before. In my line of work, you learn quickly that force is sometimes the only language a crowd understands. A firm hand, a sharp word, sometimes more. I was trained for this. Trained to maintain order in rooms where order is fragile, where accusations fly and tempers crack like kindling catching fire. That night was supposed to be simple. Keep the prisoner quiet. Keep the proceedings moving. Keep the religious leaders satisfied so they could finish their business before dawn. I'd done this work for years, stood in countless chambers while men were questioned, accused, condemned. I'd learned to see them all the same way, as problems to be managed, not people to be known. But I remember the texture of that moment. The way my palm connected with his face, the sound it made in that stone room, the silence that followed. It was late. Much later than trials usually ran. They'd brought him in with his hands already bound, his face already marked from wherever they'd taken him first. I didn't ask questions. That wasn't my role. My role was to stand, to watch, to intervene only when necessary. The room was crowded with voices, priests and elders circling like birds of prey, their words sharp and overlapping. They were building something, a case, a narrative, a consensus that would justify what they'd already decided. He stood in the center of it, calm, unnervingly calm. I'd seen prisoners before, how they shrink under accusation, how they plead or rage or collapse into themselves. But he stood there like a man who knew something the rest of the room didn't, like he was attending his own trial as a witness, not a defendant. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. They threw questions at him, rapid, harsh, designed to trap. Are you the Christ? The Son of the Blessed One? I expected deflection. I expected the kind of careful, measured response men give when they're trying to survive the night. But he didn't deflect. He looked at the high priest, straight into his eyes, and said, I am. The room erupted, shouting, gasping, robes tearing in theatrical outrage. I felt the anger rise around me like heat from a fire, the kind of anger that needs somewhere to go, something to strike. And he just stood there, still calm, still looking at them like he pitied them. That's when the high priest turned to me, not with words, just a glance. The kind of glance that carries an order without needing to speak it. I knew what he wanted. Silence the prisoner, remind him where he stands, restore the room's sense of control. It's a thing I'd done before, a sharp correction, a reminder that defiance has consequences. I stepped forward. The room seemed to hold its breath. He didn't flinch, didn't turn away, didn't brace himself. He just looked at me, and I struck him across the face. I've tried to forget the feeling of it, the way my hand met flesh and bone, the way his head turned with the force, the way the room seemed to approve, nodding, murmuring, as if I'd done something necessary and right. But what I can't forget, what I've never been able to shake, is what happened next. He straightened, slowly, and he looked at me. Not with hatred, not with fear, not even with surprise. He looked at me the way you'd look at someone you were trying to help understand something important, something they were missing. His eyes weren't accusing me. They were seeing me. All of me. Every choice I'd made to get to that moment. Every time I'd told myself that orders were orders, that my role was my role, that maintaining control justified the means. He saw all of it, and somehow in that look, I felt known in a way I'd never felt known before. I stepped back. My hand was still warm from the contact. The room continued its chaos around us, voices rising, accusations multiplying, the machinery of condemnation grinding forward. But for that one moment it was just him and me. And I wanted to say something. I don't know what. An apology, maybe, an explanation. Some way to tell him that I was just doing my job, that I wasn't a cruel man, that this wasn't personal. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep inside, I knew they'd be lies. It was personal. Every act of violence is. They took him away not long after, handed him over to the Romans. Pilate's problem now, they said. I stayed behind in that stone room, watching the priests and elders disperse into the early morning darkness, their work complete. My hand still tingled. I kept flexing my fingers, trying to shake the sensation, but it wouldn't leave. I told myself it would fade, that by the next day it would be just another forgotten moment in a career full of them. I'd struck prisoners before. This was no different. Except it was. Because when I closed my eyes that night, I saw his face again. Not the moment of impact, the moment after. That look. That unbearable, unshakable look of someone who knew exactly who I was and what I'd done, and still somehow refused to hate me for it. I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness of my small room, listening to the city wake around me, and I couldn't stop replaying it. The sound, the feeling, the eyes. What kind of man looks at his attacker with something like sorrow instead of rage? What kind of man stands in a room full of people calling for his death and remains that steady, that present, that aware? I'd been taught that prisoners were less than us, that maintaining order required a certain hardness, a certain distance. But he'd looked at me like I mattered, like my soul mattered, like what I'd just done to him mattered not because it hurt him, but because it hurt me. By morning the city was buzzing with news. The Romans had him now. Pilate was involved. There was talk of crucifixion. I wanted to forget. I wanted to go back to my post, back to my duties, back to the comfortable numbness of routine. But I couldn't. Because every time I tried to move forward, I felt his eyes on me again. Seeing me. Knowing me. Refusing to let me hide behind my role, my orders, my justifications. I heard later what they did to him, the whipping, the thorns, the nails. I heard how he carried his own cross through the streets, how he died between two criminals on a hill outside the city. And I heard, though I didn't believe it at first, that even as they crucified him, he asked his God to forgive them. Forgive them, the ones driving the nails, the ones mocking him. The ones who struck him in dark rooms and told themselves it was necessary. I don't know if that forgiveness includes me. I don't know if one slap in a crowded chamber is the kind of thing that can be forgiven, or if it's too small to even matter in the scope of what happened to him. But I know this. I can't forget his eyes. I can't unfeel my hand against his face. I can't pretend I was just following orders, just doing my job. Just one small part of a machine too large to question. Because he looked at me, and in that look, I wasn't a guard. I wasn't a role. I was a man who had a choice, and I made it. I reported for duty the next evening. Same post, same stone corridors, same torchlight casting shadows on walls that had witnessed 1,000 nights like the one before. Everything was the same. Except me. I stood at my station, hands clasped behind my back, eyes forward. The posture I'd held 1,000 times. The stance of a man who knows his place, his role, his duty. But my right hand wouldn't stop trembling, just slightly. A tremor so small no one else would notice. But I felt it. The muscle memory of impact. The echo of that moment still living in my palm. The other guards talked around me, casual conversation. The way men fill silence when the night is long and the work is dull. They spoke about the prisoner from the night before, how the Romans had taken him, how Pilate had tried to release him, but the crowd wouldn't have it, how they'd scourged him in the courtyard, 39 lashes, someone said, maybe more. One of the younger guards laughed, not cruelly, just casually. The way you laugh when you hear about something distant, something that doesn't touch you. Heard they put a crown of thorns on him, called him king. More laughter. I didn't join in. I couldn't, because I kept seeing his face, not bleeding, not broken, just looking at me. My commander noticed. He was a practical man, not unkind, but not soft either. He'd been doing this work longer than I had, and he carried it with the ease of someone who'd learned not to think too much about what the work required. "You're quiet tonight," he said. I nodded. "Just tired." He studied me for a moment, long enough that I wondered if he could see it, the thing that had changed in me, the weight I was carrying that hadn't been there 2 days before, but he just clapped my shoulder and moved on. "Get some rest when your shift ends." I said I would, but I knew I wouldn't. The problem with silence is that it gives you too much space to think. Standing there in that corridor, watching shadows flicker and listening to distant footsteps echo through stone, I couldn't stop my mind from returning to that room. The crowded chamber, the accusations flying like stones, the high priest's glance, my hand rising, the sound, his face turning, and then that look. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I'd imagined the weight of it, that in the chaos and noise and tension of that moment, I'd simply read too much into the way a prisoner glanced at his guard. But I couldn't make myself believe it, because I'd seen men look at me with hatred before, with fear, with defiance. I'd never seen someone look at me with sorrow, not for himself, for me. When my shift ended, I walked through the city instead of going home. Dawn was still an hour away. The streets were mostly empty, just a few merchants setting up early stalls, a handful of beggars finding shelter in doorways, the occasional patrol passing with torches. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to move. My feet carried me through narrow alleyways and across open squares, past the temple, past the market, past places I'd walked 100 times without thinking. But everything looked different now. Or maybe I was different, and the city only seemed changed because I was seeing it through new eyes. I found myself on a street corner near the Praetorium, the Roman headquarters. I shouldn't have been there. It wasn't my jurisdiction, wasn't my business. But I stood there anyway, watching the morning light begin to touch the tops of the buildings. A small group of women passed me. They were moving quickly, their faces drawn and tired. One of them was crying, quiet, steady tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. I recognized the look. Grief. Fresh grief. The kind that's too new to hide, too raw to contain. They disappeared around a corner, heading toward the city gates. I knew where they were going. By midday, everyone knew. The prisoner had been crucified. Golgotha, the place of the skull, the hill where Rome displayed its authority and Jerusalem learned to look away. 3 crosses, 3 men. He was the one in the middle. I heard the details in fragments, overheard conversations, whispered reports, the way news spreads through a city when something significant has happened, but no one quite knows what to make of it. They said he'd carried his own cross, until he couldn't anymore. They said the sky had darkened, that the earth had shaken. They said he'd spoken from the cross 7 times, someone claimed, though I wasn't sure if that was true or just the kind of detail people add when they're trying to make sense of something senseless. And they said he'd died, faster than most men do, asking his God to forgive the ones who'd put him there. I sat in my quarters that afternoon, staring at my hands. They looked the same as they always had, calloused, scarred in small places from years of work, strong enough to do what needed doing. But when I looked at my right hand, all I could see was that moment. The strike, the sound, the way his head had turned. I'd told myself it was necessary, that I was maintaining order, that the high priest had given me a task and I'd performed it. But sitting there in the dim light of my room, I couldn't hide behind those justifications anymore. Because he'd looked at me, and in that look he'd seen past my uniform, past my role, past every excuse I'd built to protect myself from the truth. He'd seen a man making a choice, and I'd chosen violence. I tried to pray that night. I'm not a religious man, not in the way the priests are, with their rituals and their certainty, but I'd grown up with prayers, simple ones, the kind you learn as a child and carry into adulthood without thinking too much about whether you believe them. I knelt beside my bed and tried to find words, but they wouldn't come. Because how do you pray when you've just participated in killing the kind of man who forgives his killers? How do you ask for mercy when you've shown none? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams. Not nightmares exactly. Just his face, over and over. That moment after the strike, his eyes meeting mine, seeing me, knowing me, refusing to hate me even as I gave him every reason to. I woke in darkness, my heart racing, my right hand clenched into a fist. The room was silent, but I could still feel it. The texture of that violence, the weight of that look, the knowledge that I'd been part of something I didn't fully understand, something that felt larger and darker and more significant than one guard striking one prisoner in one crowded room. The next day I requested a different assignment. My commander raised an eyebrow. "You've worked trials for 3 years. Why the change?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound weak, so I just said, "I think it's time." He studied me again, that same searching look from before. Then he nodded. "Gate duty, starting tomorrow." I thanked him, but I knew, even as I walked away, that changing my post wouldn't change what I was carrying. Because the problem wasn't the room, it wasn't the work, it was me, and what I'd done, and the look that wouldn't stop following me into every quiet moment, every dark corner, every attempt to move forward and forget. I'd struck a man. I'd done it because I was told to, because it was my role, because maintaining order sometimes requires force. But he'd looked at me afterward like none of that mattered, like the only thing that mattered was the choice I'd made, and the man I'd become by making it. Gate duty meant watching people leave. Every morning the same flow. Merchants with carts, pilgrims heading home, families carrying belongings on their backs. The rhythm of a city exhaling after Passover, returning to its normal size. I checked cargo, verified travel papers when necessary, asked questions that rarely mattered. It was simple work, mindless work, exactly what I'd wanted. But on the 3rd day I saw her. She was older, maybe 50, maybe 60, hard to tell with women who've lived hard lives. Her clothes were worn but clean. She carried a small bundle wrapped in linen. She wasn't trying to leave the city. She was coming back in, and her face was wrong. Not sad exactly, not grieving in the way I'd seen others grieve. She looked hollowed out, like something essential had been removed and she was still learning how to stand without it. I almost let her pass without a word, but something made me speak. "Where are you coming from?" She stopped, looked at me with eyes that seemed to see past my uniform, past my question, past everything I was trying to hide behind. "The tomb," she said quietly. My throat tightened. "Which tomb?" "The one they gave him, after." She didn't need to say his name. I knew. I should have let her go, should have nodded and stepped aside and let her disappear into the crowded streets, but I couldn't. "You knew him," I said. Not a question. She studied me for a long moment. "I did. Were you family?" "Close enough." She adjusted her bundle. "I helped care for him when he was a child. Watched him grow, listened to him teach." A pause. "Watched him die." The words hung between us like something physical. "What was he like?" I asked. I don't know why I asked. Don't know what I was hoping to hear. Maybe I wanted her to tell me he was difficult, defiant, the kind of man who invited trouble. Maybe I wanted permission to believe that what happened to him was somehow justified. She looked at me carefully. "Why do you want to know?" "I was there at the trial." Something shifted in her expression, not anger, something harder to name. "Which trial, the priest's or Pilate?" "The priest's." She nodded slowly. "Then you saw him answer them?" "I did." "And what did you think?" I hesitated, because the truth was complicated. Because I'd spent days trying not to think about what I'd seen, what I'd done, what it meant. But standing there at the gate with this woman who'd loved him looking at me like she could see straight through to the parts of myself I was trying to ignore, I couldn't hide. "I thought he was either telling the truth or insane," I said quietly, and he didn't seem insane. She almost smiled. "No, he wasn't." Then he really believed he was. The Messiah, the Son of God? She said it without hesitation, without doubt. He didn't just believe it. He is. Present tense, not was, is. I felt something cold move through my chest. "He's dead," I said. "I saw the body myself," she replied. "Helped prepare it for burial. He was dead." Then, 3 days ago, I went to the tomb to anoint him properly. The stone was rolled away. The body was gone. I shook my head. "Someone took it, grave robbers or—" "I saw him." The word stopped me cold. "Alive?" I asked, though I already knew her answer. Alive. I wanted to call her crazy, wanted to dismiss it as grief playing tricks, as desperate hope creating illusions. But she didn't look hopeful. She looked terrified and certain in equal measure. "That's impossible," I said. "I watched them crucify him. I watched him stop breathing. I helped wrap his body and lay it in the tomb." Her voice was steady, and 2 days later I spoke with him in a garden. He said my name. "People don't come back from death." "No," she agreed, "they don't." She adjusted her bundle again, preparing to leave. "Unless they're more than people." She started to walk past me. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached out, not touching her, just gesturing for her to wait. "At the trial," I said, "I struck him." She stopped. The high priest wanted him silenced. I was the one who, my voice caught. I hit him across the face. She turned back to me slowly. "And now it haunts you," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She looked at me for a long time, not with hatred, not with pity either, with something closer to recognition. "Do you know what he said?" she asked. "When they were nailing him to the cross?" I shook my head. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." I'd heard the words before, but hearing them from her, from someone who'd been there, who'd watched it happen, they landed differently, heavier. He was talking about the soldiers, I said. He was talking about everyone. She paused. Including you. My throat was tight. I knew what I was doing. Did you? She tilted her head slightly. Did you know you were striking the Son of God? Did you understand who he was, what he was offering, what it would cost him? I was following orders. Yes, she said gently, and so were the men who crucified him, and he asked God to forgive them anyway. Why? The question came out raw, almost angry. Why would someone forgive the people torturing him? Why would he look at me, at all of us, with anything other than rage? Because that's who he is, she said simply. That's what he came to do. She shifted her bundle one more time. I should go, she said, but I'll tell you what I know. He's alive. I don't understand how, but I know what I saw. And if he's alive, then everything he said was true. What did he say? That he came to seek and save the lost. She looked at me steadily. That he came for people who know they've done wrong and can't fix it themselves. She started walking, called back over her shoulder. If you want to find him, he's not hard to find. He never was. I stood at the gate for the rest of my shift, watching people come and go, thinking about her words, thinking about the impossibility of what she'd claimed. Thinking about the look he'd given me in that crowded room, the look that had followed me through every day since, the look I couldn't escape no matter how I tried. What if she was right? What if the man I'd struck wasn't just a man? What if the forgiveness he'd offered from the cross wasn't just words spoken in delirium, but something real, something meant for me? That night, I didn't try to pray. I just sat in the darkness and let myself feel the full weight of it. The violence I'd done, the man I'd hurt, the possibility, impossible, terrifying, necessary, that he might still be alive, and that he might be exactly who he'd claimed to be. I didn't have answers. But for the first time since that night in the chamber, I stopped trying to run from the questions. I let them sit with me, let them break me open, let myself become the kind of man who could admit he'd been wrong, who'd done harm, who needed something he couldn't earn or achieve or justify his way into. I let myself become someone who needed forgiveness and didn't know if he deserved it. I started asking questions, quietly, carefully. The kind of questions a man asks when he's not sure he wants the answers but can't stop himself from searching. At the market, I listened to merchants arguing about what had happened. Some said the disciples had stolen the body. Others said it was a Roman trick to discredit the priests. A few spoke in hushed voices about people who claimed they'd seen him walking, talking, eating fish like nothing had happened. I didn't join the arguments. I just listened. And the more I listened, the less certain I became about anything. There was a man who sold bread near the temple steps. I'd bought from him before. Never spoke much beyond the transaction. But he had the kind of face that invited conversation. Open, weathered, patient. One morning, I stopped at his stall longer than usual. "You hear about the Nazarene?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He looked up from arranging his loaves. "Everyone's heard." "What do you think happened?" He was quiet for a moment, hands still working. "I think the world doesn't know what to do with a man like that." "What kind of man?" "The kind who loves people more than power." He glanced at me. "The kind who'd rather die than compromise what he knew was true." Did you ever hear him teach? Once, maybe 2 years ago. He smiled slightly. He talked about bread, actually. Said he was the bread of life, that whoever came to him would never hunger. What did that mean? I don't know. The baker shrugged. But the way he said it, you believed he meant it. That he could somehow fill the empty places in a person. I walked away from that conversation more unsettled than when I'd started it. Because I knew about empty places, I'd felt mine growing wider every day since that night. Every time I closed my eyes, every time I looked at my right hand, every time I stood at my post and tried to convince myself I was still the same man I'd been before. The empty places weren't from hunger. They were from knowing I'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it. From realizing I'd been so focused on maintaining order that I'd forgotten to ask whether the order I was maintaining was just. A week after my conversation with the woman at the gate, I was assigned to a patrol near the Mount of Olives. It was evening. The light was fading. The city below us glowed warm as lamps were lit and cooking fires were started. My partner was young, maybe 20, still new enough to the work that he asked questions instead of just accepting things. You think it's true, he asked as we walked. What they're saying about the Nazarene? Which part? That he's alive, that people have seen him. I kept walking. I don't know. But you were there, weren't you? At the trial? I stopped. Who told you that? He looked uncomfortable. People talk. I just heard you were one of the guards that night. I turned back to the path. I was there. What was he like? I'd been asked that question before. By myself, in the dark hours when I couldn't sleep. By the ghosts that followed me through empty corridors. But this was the first time someone had asked me out loud. He was calm, I said finally. Calmer than anyone I've ever seen in that position. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Did you believe him? When he said he was the Messiah? I wanted to say no. Wanted to tell this young guard that it was all just theater, just one more deluded man claiming divine authority. But I couldn't. I didn't want to, I said. But there was something about him, the way he looked at people, like he could see all the way through them and still didn't look away. My partner was quiet for a moment. They say he forgave everyone, even the ones who killed him. So I've heard. Do you think that's true? I stopped walking again, turned to face the city spread out below us, the temple rising above everything else, the narrow streets webbing between buildings, the lives being lived in those spaces, people eating, arguing, loving, dying, people trying to make sense of a world that rarely made sense. I struck him, I said. The young guard looked at me, unsure how to respond. During the trial, the high priest wanted him quiet. I was the one they used to do it. I flexed my right hand, the motion automatic now, and after I hit him, he looked at me, not with anger, not with fear, just he looked at me like he knew exactly who I was and what I'd done, and it hurt him. Not the strike, what it meant, what it said about me. What did it say? That I was the kind of man who could hurt someone to avoid questioning my orders. I turned back to him. That I valued my position more than I valued truth. We stood there in the growing darkness. Below us, the city continued its evening rhythms. Above us, stars were beginning to appear. So, do you think he'd forgive you? The young guard asked quietly. I don't know. The words felt honest, which made them painful. I don't know how forgiveness works when you can't undo what you've done, when the person you hurt might be more than just a person. They say he told his followers to forgive 70 times 7 times, that there's no limit to it. Where'd you hear that? My mother, she heard him speak once, in Galilee. He looked embarrassed. She believed him, still does, even after everything. And you? He shrugged. I don't know. But I think if he really did come back from death, then maybe he's the kind of person who means what he says, even the impossible things. That night, I couldn't go back to my quarters. I walked instead, through empty streets, past shuttered shops, past the temple, massive and silent in the darkness. I found myself at the edge of the city, near the garden where they said he'd been arrested. I didn't know why I'd come here, didn't know what I was looking for, but I stood among the olive trees and let myself remember, not just the trial, not just the strike and the look, but everything the woman had said, everything the baker had implied, everything the young guard's mother apparently believed, that this man had claimed to be more than human, that he'd lived like it was true, that he'd died rather than deny it, and that somehow, impossibly, he might still be alive. I knelt in the dirt, not to pray exactly. I still didn't have words for that, but to acknowledge something I'd been running from since the moment my hand connected with his face. I'd been wrong, not just in the action, in the assumption beneath it, that my role mattered more than the person in front of me, that maintaining order was more important than asking whether the order was just, that I could participate in condemning a man and walk away unchanged. I'd been wrong about all of it. I don't know if you can hear me, I said to the darkness, to the olive trees, to whatever might be listening. I don't know if you're alive or dead or something else entirely, but if you are who you said you were. My voice broke. I'm sorry for what I did, for not stopping them, for being too afraid of losing my position to risk standing up for what was right. The words felt small, inadequate, like trying to fill an ocean with a cup, but they were all I had. I stayed there until dawn began to touch the horizon. No voice answered me, no figure appeared among the trees, just silence, and olive branches moving in the wind, and the slow lightening of the sky. But something had shifted. Not in the world around me, in me. I'd stopped running from what I'd done, stopped hiding behind justifications and roles and orders. I'd looked at it directly, named it, admitted it. And in that admission, I felt the first small movement of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not peace exactly, but the possibility of it. The knowledge that whatever came next, whether he was alive or dead, whether forgiveness was possible or not, I could face it as someone who'd stopped lying to himself, as someone who knew what he'd done and desperately wanted to be different. I didn't see him. Not the way the woman at the gate had. Not the way others claimed they had, in locked rooms on roads by the sea. But I felt his presence everywhere. In the questions I couldn't stop asking, in the silence that followed them. In the way the city seemed different now, like I was seeing it through eyes that had been washed clean of something I'd been carrying for too long. I kept working, kept standing at the gate, kept checking cargo and verifying papers and doing the small, mindless tasks that filled the hours, but I wasn't the same man doing them. 2 weeks after my night in the garden, a group passed through my gate. 11 men, maybe 12. It was hard to count because they kept close together, moving like people who'd learned to watch their backs. One of them looked familiar. Broad shoulders, weathered face, the hands of someone who'd worked with rope and nets his whole life. A fisherman. I'd seen him before. Months ago, maybe longer, standing at the edge of a crowd while the Nazarene taught, staying close, protective. He met my eyes as he passed, and I saw something there I recognized. Guilt, grief, and underneath it something newer, something that looked almost like hope, but fragile, like it might break if you examined it too closely. "Wait," I said. The group stopped. The fisherman turned back. "Yes? You were with him, the Nazarene." The others tensed, hands moving slightly, instinctively toward weapons they probably didn't have. But the fisherman just nodded. "I was." "Are the stories true? That he's alive?" He studied me carefully. "Who's asking?" "Someone who was there, at the trial with the priests." Something changed in his expression, not anger, something heavier. "Which side were you on?" "The wrong one." The words came out before I could stop them. Simple, honest, the kind of truth that cost something to speak. The fisherman looked at me for a long moment. Then he glanced at the others, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Come with us," he said. "I'm on duty." "For how long?" I looked at the position of the sun. "Another hour." "We'll wait." I almost told them no, almost sent them on their way and went back to the comfortable numbness of my post, the familiar routine that asked nothing of me but compliance. But I didn't, because I'd spent weeks running from the truth, and I was tired of running. "There's a courtyard, 2 streets east. I'll meet you there when my shift ends." The fisherman nodded. "We'll be there." The hour crawled by. Every merchant who passed, every traveler I questioned, every mundane interaction felt stretched, endless, keeping me from something I both wanted and feared. When my replacement finally arrived, I didn't wait, didn't stop to explain, just walked directly to the courtyard I'd mentioned. They were there, sitting in the shade, talking quietly among themselves. When I approached, they stood. The fisherman stepped forward. "I'm Peter," he said. We were his followers before." "Before what?" "Before we scattered, when they arrested him." His voice was rough. "When I denied I even knew him." I looked at him carefully. This was a man who'd walked with the Nazarene for years, who'd heard him teach, seen him heal, believed enough to leave everything and follow, and he'd denied him. I'd struck him. We were both standing in the wreckage of our choices. "Why did you ask me to come?" I said. Another man spoke up, younger, intense eyes. "Because Peter thinks you need to hear what we've seen." "And what have you seen?" Peter took a breath. "Him, alive, not a spirit, not a vision, him, with the nail marks still in his hands, eating food, speaking to us like he used to. That's impossible." "Yes," Peter agreed. "It is, and I watched it happen anyway." They told me their stories, how they'd hidden after the crucifixion, doors locked, terrified that what had happened to him would happen to them, how he'd appeared in the room with them. Suddenly, without the door opening, how he'd shown them his wounds. Let Thomas touch the place where the spear had pierced his side. How he'd asked if they had anything to eat and shared fish with them like it was the most natural thing in the world. "He's not a ghost," one of them said. "Ghosts don't eat breakfast." Despite everything, I almost smiled. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Peter looked at me steadily. "Because you said you were on the wrong side. And I know what that feels like. I denied him 3 times, swore I didn't know him, and after he rose, I thought there was no way he'd want anything to do with me after that. But he did. He found me. At the shore where I'd gone back to fishing, trying to pretend none of it had happened. and he asked me 3 times if I loved him. Peter's voice cracked slightly. 3 times, once for every denial, giving me a chance to make it right, to say out loud what I'd failed to say when it mattered. What did you say? The truth. That I did love him, that I always had, even when I was too afraid to show it. I sat down on the edge of the courtyard wall. I struck him, I said quietly. During the trial, the high priest wanted him silenced, and I was the one who did it. And after, he looked at me. I stopped searching for words. He looked at me like he could see everything I'd ever done, everything I'd ever been, and he didn't hate me for it. He just knew. The men were silent. I've been carrying that look ever since, I continued. Can't sleep without seeing it. Can't use my right hand without feeling it. Can't convince myself I was just following orders or just doing my job. Because you weren't, Peter said gently. You were making a choice. Same as I was when I denied him. Same as all of us when we ran and left him to die alone. So what do we do with that? Peter came and sat beside me. He told me something. After I'd said I loved him 3 times, he said, "Feed my sheep," like he was giving me something to do, something that mattered. Not because I deserved it, but because that's who he is. I don't understand. He forgives people who don't deserve it, who can't earn it, who've done exactly the things they're most ashamed of. Peter looked at his own hands, and then he gives them something to do, something that matters. Not to pay him back, you can't pay back someone who died for you, but to live differently, to become the person he always saw you could be. One of the other men spoke. He's leaving soon, ascending, he called it, going back to his father. Then I've missed my chance, I said. To see him? Maybe, but not to follow him. Peter stood. We're going to keep doing what he taught us. Keep telling people about him. Keep living the way he showed us. I'm not one of you. I'm a guard. I work for the people who killed him. So did I once. I was a fisherman who thought the kingdom of God would come through power and violence. I was wrong about everything. He extended his hand. But he didn't give up on me. And I don't think he's given up on you either. I looked at his hand. Calloused. Strong. The hand of someone who'd learned to hold on even when everything else was falling apart. I took it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, I said. None of us did. We're still figuring it out. Peter pulled me to my feet. But start by forgiving yourself, because he already has. And then you live like someone who's been forgiven. Like someone who knows they were lost and got found anyway. They left shortly after that. Heading north, they said, back to Galilee where it had all started. To wait for whatever came next. I didn't go with them. Not because I didn't want to, but because I had things to settle first. A life to untangle. Questions to answer about what it meant to follow someone I'd helped condemn. But as I walked back through the city, something had changed. The weight was still there. The memory of what I'd done. The look that had haunted me for weeks. But it felt different now. Not lighter exactly, just carried differently. Like something I could learn to live with. Something that didn't have to define me, even though it would always be part of me. That night, I slept. Really slept. For the first time since the trial. And when I dreamed, I didn't see his face turning after the strike. I saw him standing in a room full of frightened men, showing them his wounds, asking if they had anything to eat. I saw him at a shore, cooking fish over a fire, asking Peter 3 times if he loved him. I saw him looking at people, broken people, guilty people, people who'd failed him in every way that mattered, and refusing to give up on them, refusing to let their worst moment be their final word. I woke before dawn, dressed quietly, walked to my post, but as I stood at the gate, watching the early morning traffic begin, I knew something had shifted permanently. I was still a guard, still wearing the uniform, still checking papers and maintaining order. But I wasn't the same man who'd stood in that crowded chamber and raised his hand because someone told him to. I was someone who'd seen what obedience without conscience could do. Someone who'd felt the weight of violence, even small violence, even justified violence. Someone who'd been forgiven for something he couldn't fix or undo or earn his way out of, and that changed everything. A man approached the gate, old, bent with age, carrying a small pack. Destination, I asked. Home, finally. Been in Jerusalem for Passover. That was weeks ago, he smiled. I stayed longer than planned, wanted to see if the stories were true. What stories? About the Nazarene, about him coming back from the dead. The old man's eyes were bright. I saw him, on the road. Talked with him for hours before I realized who he was. My throat tightened. What did you talk about? Everything. The scriptures, what the prophets said, how it all pointed to him. He adjusted his pack. He explained it all so clearly, like he'd been there for all of it, like he'd written the story himself and was just helping me understand the plot. Where is he now? Gone. Ascended, his followers say. Back to heaven. The old man smiled. But somehow I don't think he's really gone, not in the ways that matter. I let him pass. Stood there as the sun climbed higher and the city woke fully and the day began its familiar rhythms. I didn't see him, not with my eyes, but I felt him. In the stories people told, in the changes I saw in myself, in the possibility that a man could do something unforgivable and still be offered a way forward, not because he deserved it, but because that's what love does. It forgives the unforgivable. It sees people at their worst and refuses to leave them there. It dies for the very people who killed it, and then comes back offering peace instead of revenge. I still carry the memory, the sound of my hand meeting his face, the way he looked at me afterward, the weight of knowing I was part of something that shouldn't have happened. But I carry something else now too, the knowledge that he looked at me and saw someone worth dying for, worth forgiving, worth trusting with a second chance. And that look, the one that haunted me for weeks, has become something different. Not a condemnation, an invitation. To live differently, to choose differently. To become the kind of person who values truth more than orders, mercy more than position, love more than control. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened in those days. How death became life. How an executed criminal became a risen savior. How guilt became grace. But I know this. I was lost in my certainty, comfortable in my role, blind to what my obedience was serving. And he saw me anyway, knew me anyway, forgave me anyway. Not because I deserved it, but because that's who he is and who he'll always be. The guard who struck Jesus. That's who I was. But it's not who I have to remain, because he looked at me after the blow and saw not just what I'd done, but what I could become. And that look, the one that followed me through sleepless nights and guilty days and desperate questions, has become the thing that leads me forward, not into forgetting, into remembering rightly, into living like someone who's been seen completely and loved anyway, into becoming the person he somehow believed I could be, even when I couldn't see it myself. That's the look that follows me now. not haunting, calling, and every day I try to answer.